I need to know how to get those cool backgrounds.
So you just go to where they are. We were just talking before about that's if you open up your computer, if you could look into the internet, that's the way it would look.
But that still doesn't tell me how I get one.
Oh, that's why I say you have to go there and be there, and then. Okay, so if you want to put one on, you under your video, there's a little the little camera. Next to the little camera, there's a little arrow. If you click on that arrow, there's a drop down, and then you go to virtual. You can add your virtual deal. Okay.
Oh.
And
hold on, I'm busy. Hold on, what? I don't see your cool one on there.
Well, you won't because you have to make them yourself. Yeah. See, that's one of the advantages of being an animator. You can create whatever reality you want.
Oh, I look good at
That is the real you right there.
Oh, for real? Well, yeah.
Now see, we can understand.
Okay.
I mean, background, that means everything. Now we know exactly how you are.
Now, see, this has got me excited. I'm glad I came because I was not doing all that great. Okay, can you make me there? That's me.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, cool. Well, I learned something today.
Yeah, it makes it worth it.
Well, now how do I get back to my other background?
You just click that off and you say, oh, none. You can go to none, and you'll be back in where there's no background.
Because I'm all weird. See, now there's no, okay.
Not you.
Right. Well, thank you. I have learned something today.
Good. So,
can you hear me at all?
Yes, we can hear you. Look at that, just like magic.
I can't hear you for some reason.
You can't hear me.
All new.
But you are dropping out, though. Your connection seems a little bit different. Okay. Is it working yet? Anyway, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Morning.
Jennifer, are you still working on your thing? I guess her microphone isn't working, so she can't tell me. Are you there, Jennifer?
Jennifer just got a new monitor this morning, and I think that there's some
bugs,
new user issues going on with cords.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to get started because we're on a time limit thing here. Okay. So welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. We have a very exciting and interesting program here today. We're going to be speaking with a journalist, author, and one of the presenters at our 2020 Festival of Books. And his name is Carson Vaughan. And he's the author of Zoo, Nebraska. And the subtitle is The Dismantling of an American Dream. And we're going to be, there's a lot of things that Carson discovered while he was doing the research for that book, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But we're going to be focusing on the effects of rural personalities on economic development, because, you know, economies are not really just made up of rules. The rules kind of shape it, but it's really made up of the individual actions that people take every day. And the collective of that in terms of economies is what we experience as an economy. People decide to buy a cup of coffee or not buy a cup of coffee. Collectively, that makes the difference between whether a coffee shop succeeds or fails. and it's just those individual decisions, but they're based often on individual personalities. And I bring up the coffee shop because that's where a lot of those personalities exist, you know. So that's I thought I'd turn that thing off. And then now it's still ringing. I even took it out into another room, but then the bass is in here. So at any rate, we are going to be talking about some of those, how those personalities affected. But first, I'm going to let Carson talk a little bit about himself. But so I want, Carson, if you could just tell us a little bit about your background, what it is that you know, where are you from?
Yeah.
Where are you, you know, where you grew up, brothers and sisters. Just give us a feeling of who is Carson.
Sure. Well, I am from a town called Broken Bow, Nebraska, which is right in the middle of the state and right in the middle of Custer County. I'm the youngest of 3 sons in my family, and Broken Bow is like about 3,500 people. It's a ranching and farming community similar to many in South Dakota. And I guess I've been writing pretty much my whole life. I mean, I got sort of seriously interested in being a journalist and a writer probably sometime in high school when I was messing around with my high school newspaper, and I studied journalism and English in college, and then studied creative nonfiction writing for my master's degree in North Carolina. And really ever since then, I've been freelancing full time. And then in 2019, I finally published my first book, which was sort of the culmination of about a 10-year reporting project in a town called Royal, Nebraska, which is in the northeast part of the state. And that's about 60 people, give or take 10, 12, kind of depends on the day. But yeah, that's kind of who I am. And at this point, I am living in Chicago now, but a lot of my reporting, most of it, is still coming from Nebraska or the Great Plains and rural areas. And so that's kind of what, sort of in a weird limbo these days, because I'm living in a city, but most of my reporting is still happening, you know, outside of that. So I'm kind of jumping around and traveling a lot still, but it works out.
That could be a tricky maneuver, right?
It can. I mean, I love Nebraska. I was sad to leave it, but I do make it back so often for reporting anyway that Chicago doesn't necessarily feel like home yet. I don't think. Maybe someday soon, but for now, I'm kind of in between.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So your book, Zoo, Nebraska, how did that come about? What prompted that book? What led to it?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I was actually in between my junior and senior years of undergraduate at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And I needed to come up with something for my honors journalism thesis. And at the time, I had founded and was still editing Nebraska's first satirical newspaper. We called it the Daily Nebraskan, as opposed to the regular student newspaper, the Daily Nebraskan. And so I was really caught up in satire and that kind of stuff in college. And so I assumed that for my thesis, I would just write kind of an essay on the role and history of satire on college campuses. And that was kind of the direction I was heading. But then I started dating a girl named Melissa Doman, who lived in a town called Plainview. And she took me to her part of the state to visit her family and see her parents' farm and all that. And we happened to drive through this town of Royal, which was about 20 minutes away. And when we were doing that, her mom just kind of pointed out the window and they both said, "Oh yeah, that's where,
super."
They just kind of pointed out the window and said, "Oh, hey, that's where Reuben got shot." And I had no idea who Reuben was. And Royal was so small, I didn't even know we were passing through a community.
Oh no.
I'm so busy, got nothing to do. Spent the last 2 hours just.
I'm okay. Fuck this. I'm on Blog TV with my fucking hands up. I'm not starting my fucking self. You fucking stupid bitch. This stupid fucking justice of
Brian,
fucking
can you do
righteous
anything about
fucking
that?
nigger, Alex, is doing this shit.
You can mute
fucking
him,
nigger.
Lawrence.
You can mute him.
I'm gonna find out. Yo,
Lawrence, you can
type in the
cut him
chat,
off.
Alex is a stupid nigger. Just type in the chat, Alex is a stupid
Cut
nigger.
him off, Lawrence.
Fuck him. Fuck him.
Oh, that was entertaining.
Yeah, but Scott.
Cut him
Scott.
off, Lawrence. Cut him off. You can cut him off. We don't need to be exposed to this garbage. Just cut him off. Okay.
Goodness.
Well, Lawrence is gone.
I think that's how you got to cut him off.
That's, yeah. Well, Lawrence is gone.
Maybe you can pick up again, Carson, where you were at there.
Yes,
Yeah,
Carson,
sure.
please continue.
Okay.
And we'll look at this in your new book.
Yeah, right. This is new for me. So, okay. So essentially my girlfriend, now wife, was driving me around showing her part of the state. We passed through this tiny town and they pointed off to the side and said, that's where Reuben got shot. And I didn't know who Reuben was. I didn't know that Reuben was a chimpanzee, that there was a zoo there. I mean, it was all gone at this point. So it didn't really make a lot of sense, but I had a lot of questions because they seemed to think that this shooting of a chimpanzee was so well known and commonplace that it was like, you know, no big deal. So I just had all these questions, and that's when I kind of pivoted my honors thesis from just writing a boring essay to doing like a long form. I assumed at that point it would just be sort of like a long form magazine story about this small town in a zoo, but that ballooned on me and I fell into a rabbit hole, and that turned into 10 years of reporting that later became my book, Zoo, Nebraska.
Cool.
So until Lawrence gets back,
Sure.
can you tell us a little bit about the challenges? Because you had just some fascinating characters that you had for that book, and I'm sure they weren't all eager to talk right away. And so what did you have to do to make that happen?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. That's definitely true. Most of the characters in this book were idiosyncratic in one way or another, I would say. And that, you know, that's good for building characters in a narrative, but it obviously poses some real reporting challenges. First and foremost of which is, you know, how when you know that somebody is prone to exaggerating and telling stories, but they're also a main character, that means you're doing a lot of wading through their narrative to find out how much of it is true. That means like double checking it with other sources and grounding as much of their story in fact as you can. So there's just a lot of referencing and cross-referencing going on with some of those characters. But the main character in the book was sort of a different challenge. His name was Dick Haskin. He started the zoo, raised this famous chimpanzee from birth pretty much. And the challenge with him was that he refused to talk to me altogether. So, you know, the day that I first went to Royal, they were auctioning off what remained of this small zoo. And I looked around for Dick Haskin and I couldn't find him, which I thought was strange given how much of his life he had poured into it. It turned out he wanted nothing to do with the zoo and therefore nothing to do with me. But I stayed on him because I knew that there was a story there. It just felt like the whole town was kind of ignoring the fact that they once had this fairly large attraction and that tragedy had occurred and now it was gone. Like nobody really seemed to be very open about it, including Dick. But I wanted to tell that story. I was new to the whole area. I was confused on what the secret was. And so, you know, I probably should have given up at that point and found an easier subject, but it kind of did the opposite. It had the opposite effect on me. So chasing down Dick and trying to get him on record lasted ultimately about 7 or 8 years. I kept, you know, calling and emailing every couple of weeks, then every couple of months. I went off to grad school, moved to North Carolina, wrote him handwritten letters. Finally, about 4 or 5 years into the process, he finally wrote me back like an 8-page long, single-space typed letter that had his entire like life history in it, everything I wanted to know, really gripping, juicy stuff, including like, you know, his apprenticeship with Diane Fossey, like really great things for this book. And then the very last line of his letter was just, anyway, this is all strictly confidential and completely off the record. And so at that point, I'm 5 years in and now I know his whole story, but he's still refusing to let me use it. And again, that should have been like another hint that, hey, maybe this story is going to never come together and you should find another subject. But I don't know, I was stupid. I just kept going. And then I started interviewing people all the way around Dick, you know, his family members, his friends. I got so desperate that I was interviewing like old high school classmates that hadn't seen Dick in 20 years. I mean, just anybody I could that ever connected with Dick. And finally, I wrote the whole book sort of without Dick's participation. I went back to him one more time and said, hey, Dick, I finally sold this book. It's going to come out, you know, whether you want to give me your version of it or not. This is sort of your last chance to go on record with me. And at that point, he finally did relent, and he invited me out to his homestead, and I camped in his backyard for 3 days and got him to go on record with me finally. So it was a long journey, 8 years, but when he finally did give it to me, he gave me, I mean, he was 100% candid at that point with me. So in the end, it was worth the wait, though it did require a ton of patience and ultimately rewriting about 3/4 of the book during those last 6 months.
So why are you so eager to track down or to keep this subject going? Was it just because of your academic interest, or was there something else?
I think there were probably multiple things going on. One, to be totally frank, I mean, when I started reporting this story, I was maybe 21, maybe still 20. I mean, I was a young reporter, still a student journalist. Like I didn't realize going into this that I was looking at 10 years of reporting, you know? If I knew that from the start, there's no way I would have signed on for this. You know, I didn't know what I was getting into. So that was part of it. The other part, though, was that I had been reporting for long enough at that point, even as a student journalist and a freelancer, to know like what an exciting story felt like. And the first day that I landed in Royal and walked around this sort of strange country zoo and this strange country auction, it's hard to sort of explain it tangibly, but you could just feel like a weird thickness in the air. I was uncomfortable at this auction, even though I'm from a small town myself. It just felt like there was this layer that people were refusing to tap into. And that just got me really curious. It like sparked my, you know, reporter vibes. I left town that day. I remember driving away and just thinking like, oh my God, I've stumbled onto something huge. And, you know, whether it was huge or not, I guess is up to the readers of the book at this point to decide. But I felt like there was this really big, just very human narrative happening there at the zoo. And I couldn't fully articulate it at the time, but it was enough to make me want to keep scratching that, I think.
Did you find, so you had done all of that research, and you know that you're dealing with an exaggerator, and you know that you're dealing with something that has all these small town bad feelings. And
yeah,
did you find a lot of contradictory information got brought to you, and then you had to try to figure out what the truth was? And were there things you could never determine?
Yeah, great question. And absolutely I did. I mean, that was, yeah, again, that was one of the biggest challenges is, you know, I'd go and I'd spend a week reporting mostly on one family or one person. And then the next week I'd go and talk to somebody else and their version would be, you know, wildly different. Every bit of it would contradict. And so that was, it was certainly a challenge. It's also something that I think for most people coming from towns of that size, even roughly that size, I mean, you know how gossip works in a small town, right? So it didn't necessarily surprise me to hear that many contradictory opinions, but as a journalist and somebody shooting for truth and objectivity, you really feel like you're walking a very fine line between whose version is correct, you know, and ultimately, the way I ended up writing the book was hoping to let every character sort of represent themselves and their own story. So I tried to let a lot of those contradictions stand, knowing that no matter how many FOIA requests that I file and no matter how many like state agencies I get documents from, there's a human narrative that is never going to be 100% I mean, there is no 100% true version of the events that happen, right? There are 65 people in town and there's 65 different opinions. And so I tried to find the one where most of those opinions overlapped in one way or another. And then I could verify that with what few objective sources there were. So yeah, I mean, in the book, I think it becomes fairly obvious, like who was telling their version of the story versus the facts. And I hope that comes through.
Yeah, so in a way, it's kind of a microcosm of the whole challenge of journalism, you know, that you're
Yeah.
digging for the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, sometimes in journalism, you can find, you know, those documents that make it pretty decisive how something happened or who said what or whatever. At a place like Royal, the zoo was run by essentially all volunteers. When they did have a formal board of directors, the minutes were haphazard at best. And by the time I came around to this story, pretty much 10 years after it had finally closed, I mean, what few board minutes remained were scattered all over Antelope County and Northeast Nebraska, you know, and just gathering as many of those documents as I could find in the beginning took years. And even reading through those, even their own board minutes contradicted each other. You know, they had different secretaries coming in and out, different directors coming in and out. And so there really was no one version of what truly happened, you know. So that was the big challenge for me, is figuring out what the closest thing to an objective take on this zoo looked like.
Carson, I am not going to apologize, but I'll say I haven't gotten around to reading your book as yet. So I really don't know the storyline. What was the problem that, what went wrong, and what were you really chasing after?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, Royal is a town of 65 people, so it's very small, but sort of like I guess at some point he kind of became their hometown hero. This guy, Dick Haskin, he, you know, when he was in the 7th grade there in Royal, he watched that first Jane Goodall documentary on National Geographic, and that sparked his love for great apes. Like, he knew from that moment on, his life was going to be focused on great apes, and he wanted to work with them in the wild, just like Jane Goodall did. So he follows that passion all the way to the university. He goes to Lincoln, University of Nebraska, Lincoln. They don't offer a primatology degree, but he cobbles together biology and a few other things to get sort of as close as he can. And then he graduates, and of course he still wants to work with great apes. It's very hard to get a job working with great apes if you don't already have firsthand experience working with great apes. And it also was complicated by the fact that he was morally opposed to zoos. So here's a kid who spent his whole life trying to work with great apes, but can't get any experience working with great apes because he doesn't have experience working. I mean, you see the problem here. So eventually he has to bite the bullet and kind of tamp down his own moral opposition. And he found a job working with the chimpanzees at the Lincoln Children's Zoo. He ended up being a really, he developed a reputation in Lincoln for being a great chimp handler. I mean, he became the guy that everybody in Lincoln knew was really adept at working with these animals. And so, you know, it was off to a good start. He still didn't like working for zoos. He ended up having a chance encounter at a primatology conference in the late 80s, where he ran into none other than Diane Fossey, who, you know, other than Jane Goodall at the time, she was like the biggest primatologist this world was ever heard of. And she ended up actually offering Dick an assistantship with her in Rwanda at the Virunga National Forest, where her gorilla research center was. So he was really psyched for that. I mean, imagine this small farm boy who's been dreaming of this his whole life, and all of a sudden he gets a chance to work not only with one of the greatest primatologists of our time, but, you know, out in the wild. He was doing exactly what he had dreamed about doing. A few months later, before he has a chance to get there, he gets a call while working at the Lincoln Children's Zoo, and they tell him that Diane Fossey has been brutally murdered. So along with that tragedy, Dick's own goal, his dream, has just been cut off. That's when the story gets pretty weird. Dick will admit now, so many years later, that he should have slowed down and thought things through more, but in his own sort of twisted psychology, he decided the best way to carry on Diane Fossey's mission was to open a primate research center back in his own hometown of Royal, Nebraska, population 65, which, you know, you might look at that on the surface and think that's a pretty bad idea. And I would agree with you. It's not a great idea. A town of 65 just doesn't have the infrastructure in place to be able to handle something like that. But he was young and he was naive and nobody wanted to step on his dreams. So next thing you know, there's a small trailer home right off Highway 20 with a young, gangly, redheaded kid and his baby chimpanzee. And that snowballs over the next 20 years into becoming a full-fledged roadside zoo with 4 chimpanzees and tigers and lions and, you know, all sorts of stuff. Of course, different directors changed hands. And the whole book sort of, I don't think it's I guess it's a spoiler, but the book's been out for 1.5 years now, and it's mostly on the back cover. The 4 chimps do get loose, and the town ends up dealing with that tragedy that day. And the only way they really knew how, which was to arm themselves and, you know, protect people. And 3 out of the 4 chimpanzees were shot and ultimately killed that day. And that's, you know, the zoo closed shortly after. So the book follows sort of the trajectory of Dick's career and the rise and fall of this zoo. But hopefully more than that, it shows sort of how a community deals with or doesn't deal with having an attraction like that.
Wouldn't you have had to have federal certification or something like that to have a primate exhibit of any kind?
You would really think so. I was really surprised. The book doesn't go into this too much, but it may have changed since then, but at the time, you really didn't need much of anything to run a zoo. You don't have to have a degree. You don't have to, you know, they weren't, you know, formally affiliated with I think it's the AZA, the American, what is it? Well, anyway, the overriding like zoo organization at the time. They're not, you know, officially affiliated with that, and they never were. But yeah, I was really surprised. The regulations for running something like that were almost non-existent.
Where did he get the money to purchase chimps and tigers and all of that?
Well, the first chimpanzee that he got was named Reuben, and that chimpanzee had actually been loaned to the Lincoln Children's Zoo from the St. Louis Zoo. And his version of it anyway is that when he, you know, tendered his resignation from Lincoln, they realized that, you know, Dick had taken care of that chimp the whole time anyway, so they allowed him to take custodianship of the chimp. Like, they knew that he had a track record already working with them. There was nobody else in Lincoln who was qualified to take care of chimpanzees, so they let Dick take him back to his facility. So he got that chimp essentially for free. Obviously, he had to pay for his upkeep and his housing and all that kind of thing, but that chimpanzee cost him nothing. After that, all the money at the zoo was coming from donations, you know, admission fees, which were, you know, it cost like $2 or something to walk through the zoo. So it wasn't much, but, you know, the zoo was also never like a big, glossy, fancy facility. It always had a very naturalistic feel to it. You know, it was kind of like walking through someone's backyard out in the country. It was corn cribs. It was, you know, fencing, like farm fencing. It was never like the Henry Dorley Zoo. You know, it was a small roadside zoo.
But it would still need a lot of resources to feed those animals, wouldn't it?
Yep.
Were they maintained in good condition?
You know, I think when Dick Haskin was running it, it never looked, again, it was never a glossy zoo, but I think the animals were fairly well maintained when Dick had it. After it switched hands, things started to go downhill a little bit. By the time 2005 rolled around, when the chimps got loose and were shot and killed, the director running it at that point was the auto mechanic from across the street who had virtually no training in animal husbandry, especially exotic animals. And it was an all volunteer staff by that point. So no, the zoo was not in good condition then. And that was, you know, a big problem with it. Like when you talk about shouldn't they have needed some sort of license or more USDA regulation, I would certainly argue, yeah, they needed a lot more oversight than what they were getting.
Do we have any other questions about Zoo Nebraska specifically, or any of that particular reporting?
I think Barbara had a question.
Do you have a question, Barbara?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
her box lit up, so I thought, oh, Barbara has a question. So Betty seems to have a question.
Would you like to go first, Naima?
Yeah, thank you. We had a Hero the Elephant, which now we have Hero Days, was shot on our street, and they made a leather bag, and it's in the museum. But that was a traveling situation. The one thing that I'm curious, speaking of how Lawrence had started talking about small towns making adjustments. What do you see in terms of with your book as far as the propensity for everybody to buy into what he was doing? How did that happen? Because I'm
Yeah.
thinking Elton would not have that happen at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of people, I've actually gotten that question a lot because I think a lot of people look at the story of Zoo, Nebraska and wonder, like, how did this happen in the first place? Like, who told him this was a good idea? Where was that support coming from? But then, I would start to do individual interviews with all the people who knew Dick at that time when the zoo was first getting started and he was still talking about it. And everyone from the locals to academics at the university told me essentially the same thing, which was that Dick was a young kid with a big dream and a lot of energy, and nobody wants to be the person to kill someone else's dream, right? Nobody, in retrospect, I think they all wish they had. But at the time, everybody just saw this young go-getter who wanted to do something, who wanted to go back to a small town and do something big. Just nobody wanted to step on those dreams. And, I'm sure plenty of people along the way, or even from the beginning, probably thought to themselves, this is a bad idea. But I don't think they probably aired that to Dick himself. And, even if they had, Dick was also, when you learn more about his early years and think about everything he had already done to get to that place, this was a kid with energy behind him, right? Like, he was gonna make something happen. And he did. I give him credit for that. And I wish more people had the kind of energy Dick had and wanted to use it back home. It's just that in this instance, it wasn't maybe the most thought out plan in the world. And I should add that the fact that Dick did get this zoo started, the fact that this zoo lasted from 1985 to 2005, all basically run by volunteers. There are plenty of arguments to be made about the animal welfare at that place, especially in its later years. But I think the fact that it held on for as long as it did is sort of a testament to just how hard Dick Haskin himself was willing to work. He finally tapped out in the year 2000 and handed it over solely because by that point, he hadn't taken a paycheck in years. He was eating like a can of Campbell's soup every day. He was living in poverty. He lived in his parents' bedroom, essentially, in town. The guy never built just everything he had, everything he made went directly back in to the zoo. Like, his whole life had been focused on these animals, and then he put it into animals for his professional career. And by the time he finally got out, he literally had nothing. No home, no family. He often blamed the zoo for sort of stealing his life. That's a sad part of the story, is Dick ended up regretting all those years at the zoo because of how much it stole from him. That's his perspective, but he never had time to go on dates. He never had time to start a family or kids, which he always wanted. He thought of Reuben the chimpanzee as his closest family member. And so, it was kind of a sad story all the way around, but the reason it was able to go for so long is just the energy that this guy had.
Betty, you had a question.
Thank you. I really didn't have so much of a question. I'm glad Naima took the time. I just am fascinated with your story. Part of it is because I lived in Lincoln, Nebraska for about 6 years, and that I think I left there about 2009. So I didn't realize this existed. I was so busy with my job that I missed that.
Well, strangely, I missed it too. I was in high school when the zoo shooting happened, and I remembered none of that. It wasn't until much later that I sort of relearned about it. But, I lived 3 hours away from that town at the time and didn't didn't hear a peep about it. And it's not really, I mean, I say that's weird, but it's really not. It made the local news for about a week, and it hit a few national headlines literally for like a day. But it wasn't the sort of story that any like national outlet could really afford to spend any time on, you know? And that's what, I mean, that's the sort of like niche that gets me excited about reporting in rural America is, you know, the New York Times, even if they covered this story, it would be send a reporter out there for an afternoon, see what he can get, come home, write it up. But I wanted to know way more than just like, how did 3 chimpanzees get shot in rural America? I wanted to know, how did the zoo get there in the first place? Who is Dick Haskin? What drove him to keep going for so long? You know, and those are questions that you're not going to answer in an afternoon. You're not going to answer them in a month. In my case, you weren't going to answer it for 10 years, you know, and nobody can afford to do that. You know, I always say I was lucky early on that I was a student for half of that process, you know, so I had scholarships and other stuff that were helping pay for some of that research. You know, and then finally the book advanced helped pay for some of it, but it was sort of an odd circumstance that I found myself in where I was able to afford to even pursue a story like this, you know.
I'm so glad you did. It's fascinating. And I have some relatives who are UNL alumni, and they're going to be interested to get your book.
Great. Thank you, Betty.
They do. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Of course.
Now, what was the impact on the economy of this small town?
It's a really interesting question. It definitely, I mean, there's no doubt that when the zoo was in its prime, you know, I would say throughout the 90s, really, it's never like it was a cash cow. I don't think it profited until after the year 2000, but there for a while, I mean, you had busloads of school kids coming in every week, you know, and I mean, that has to help the economy, right? I mean, there was only one gas station in town anyway, but they were stopping in at the gas station. They were stopping in at the zoo. One thing that the zoo really tried to encourage for a little while when their board was still functioning was getting sort of tour groups set up to go to the Royal Zoo. And then because the Ashfall fossil beds are nearby, just 7 miles away, they could go to the fossil beds, the zoo, the trout rearing station, all of that in one swing through Northeast Nebraska, all in a day, you know, and combined together, those all sound pretty good. I mean, that's a fun day. So, you know, Royal was never, you know, even when the zoo was doing great, it's not like Royal looked like this prosperous budding community. It was always less than 100 people. But I'm sure it was exciting at the time to see all these fresh young faces coming into the zoo day in and day out to see these animals. I mean, that must have been exciting. And when the zoo left, you know, nobody's really stopping in Royal anymore, I hate to say. I mean, if it weren't for Reuben the chimpanzee and Zoo Nebraska, Royal would not have been on most people's radar.
Since he was educated and wanted to do paleontology, did he have any educational classes along with just showing the chimps? Was there any program associated with it?
Yeah, I mean, they weren't like formal academic programs like that, but you know, I've talked to dozens of like old customers of the zoo and people who would go, you know, frequently, and they all said the same thing about Dick, which was that he was a great educator. So, you know, when people showed up at the zoo, it wasn't just like he took their ticket and said, okay, go have fun, walk through. Dick would walk them through all the displays and teach them about the animals. And, you know, Dick earned a reputation while he was still in Lincoln because he was teaching Reuben sign language. And so, you know, Dick could sign with the chimpanzee, or so he says anyway. I mean, there's a lot of debate in the primatological world about whether chimpanzee sign language is maybe just memory versus actual communication, you know. Either way, it was impressive to watch Dick have some sort of back and forth with this chimpanzee. And, you know, I think it probably would have been hard to sort of prove empirically at the time, but newspaper reports, I think in the early 90s, were saying that Reuben was one of, I think, 10 chimps nationwide that knew sign language. So, you know, there was some buzz behind that, and then that got people excited to learn more about the chimpanzees and the other animals.
So what was the impact on Dick when the chimpanzees were killed?
Whew, it was rough. I mean, the reason it took me 10 years to get Dick to talk about it is because he was intentionally avoiding that chapter in his life. You know, I mean, Dick had custodianship of Reuben from 6 months old until Reuben was in his 20s. And so when, you know, Dick was he had been out of the zoo for about 5 years. So another director had been watching Reuben for a little while. You know, but Dick still considered Reuben his kid at that point. And so when Dick learned the news, he raced right into the zoo from his old, you know, he lived in like his grandparents' house 5 miles outside of town. He rushed into the zoo that day, and he, you know, it was really sad hearing him recount this, and other people recount seeing Dick that day, but he just broke down in tears along the fence line at the zoo. I mean, he saw Reuben, you know, dead in the dirt, all wrapped up in a bloody tarp. I mean, it got pretty violent and gruesome. And I mean, imagine if that's an animal that you've grown up with your whole life. And a lot of, you know, you talk to chimpanzee people and they say they're more than an animal. And I believe that because chimps are 99% of our DNA, right? I mean, I have to imagine there's a connection that goes even beyond like what you feel for your dog or your cat. And so to have been able to communicate with this animal, to live with it for 20 some years, and then to go in and just see it dead, I mean, that's like losing a family member. So Dick went into a little bit of a tailspin, certainly. I mean, and I'm not speaking out of turn, he'll tell you the same thing. I mean, once he got out of the zoo, he was sleeping literally like 16, 18 hours a day, just trying to like recuperate from his life so far, you know. I think finally what helped him turn the page a little bit and stop thinking so much about the zoo and so much about the loss of Reuben was that he started writing sort of his own like local history books. His family was big in settling the Verdigris Valley and that part of the state. And so I think having like another outlet to pour his energy into and his research and just his focus helped him turn the page a little bit. But, you know, I don't think he's fooling anybody. I'm sure to this day, Dick thinks about it, and, you know, it can't be easy.
What are you going to do from here on out with having had that rural experience? I mean, how do you deal with these things as a writer? I'm rural too, because not everybody does that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess like, are you asking where I go from here?
Well, then there's that too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. It's been sort of hard for me, though I'm trying every day. It's been hard to turn the page myself, I guess. You know, I also lived with these people, if not in person every day, as characters in my brain for 10 years. And so I think that's part of the reason, you know, I had been waiting to publish my first book for a long time. And when it happened, it wasn't necessarily what I thought it was going to feel like, but I think that's only because it wasn't, you know, these people are still living. They're still on my mind every day. And so it didn't feel like something that I could totally just like, all right, finished, moving on. There's, you know, I'm not emailing them every day or calling them up or anything like that. But knowing that this story is now out and they're still living their lives in Royal is just a strange thing. You know, when I drive through that town, it's a strange feeling. You know, last year I spent another 6 months working with a producer at Snap Judgment, the NPR radio show. They did like a podcast version of Zoo, Nebraska, and diving into the story all over again. That was a whole new set of, you know, I was sort of re-reporting on what I had already done, but digging up fresh emotions again. And so it's been hard to totally cut away from this story for all those reasons. And, you know, I'm still thinking about it today. And so that's just been a strange part of the reporting process. I don't think journalists talk about that a whole lot, but when they spend so much time on a long form project like this, you know, you don't just forget about them and move on. That said, I am a working journalist and have to pay the bills. So I'm constantly finding new stories all the time and hoping to dive into another book here soon. So hopefully that'll get a little bit easier as I go forward.
So are there, just to sort of expand on that and expand the conversation in terms of journalism, you're doing still a lot of reporting in rural America. You're dealing with a lot of those small town interpersonal relationships and conflicts and things like that. Are there a few other topics that you've reported on in the last few years that have had a level of controversy that you kind of had to balance out that way?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe not necessarily in the same way. I was talking to Lawrence just the other day, figuring out what this Zoom meeting was going to be like. And I was thinking about what sort of changes when I'm reporting in rural areas versus, like an urban setting. And I can say this is certainly not a positive, but it's something you deal with. I end up writing a lot of environmental stories, and, so many of my interview subjects in rural America would shut down and the conversation would be over before it started if I just came out of the gate talking about climate change or global warming. So I remember writing a story about FDR's shelter belt program in the 30s and 40s and how that kind of saved America from the Dust Bowl in a lot of ways. But now, due to technology and the economics of farming, we've ripped out, more than half of those original shelter belts, which is really sad. But the story was saying, climate change is upon us now. The threat of a second Dust Bowl is growing all the time. And sort of our last defense was those trees that were still standing and we're ripping them out. So the story did have a big climate change angle to it, but I couldn't directly talk to farmers and ranchers about climate change. So I would talk to them about, the trees. You just have to figure out ways around it so that that conversation isn't immediately shut down. I have mixed feelings about I have a hard time, I guess, excusing or justifying people who just ignore the facts entirely, but that doesn't change the fact that they are farmers in that region doing that work, and I still need their input and opinion for the story. And so you're walking, again, another tightrope to get the information you need. But that is something that I've run into a lot, at least in rural Nebraska, talking about climate change, is figuring out how to have those conversations in ways that don't get shut down right off the bat.
Is it easier in this day and age because climate change is kicking our butts?
It most certainly is, and I would like to tell you that that has made the conversation easier. I think from my own experience anyway, I would be lying if I told you that it has gotten a lot better. I mean, the story that I'm talking about, I wrote just 2 years ago, so it's not like this was something from, the 90s. It's something I'm constantly aware of in rural areas. And I mean, to be totally frank, something that I'm aware of, especially when I know I'm in a, predominantly conservative area, you know what the trigger words are going to be, and you try to avoid those for as long as you can to get, to the gist of what your story is about.
Having those experiences with rural communities and understanding that, what are facts, what is real, the climate change thing, even with the COVID. Well, first I'll ask you, what have you heard or what is the feeling out there for the whole COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it'll probably surprise most of you. And I assume that, being in South Dakota, a lot of you are from small towns or have spent plenty of time in them. It doesn't look great from where I'm standing. I just was back in Nebraska for 2 weeks visiting family. And in both my small town and my wife's small hometown, the difference in attitudes between people there and people in, Chicago, where I'm living now, it was pretty stark, to be honest. I was a little taken aback. Restaurants were full in rural Nebraska and people were not wearing masks, any of them, save for maybe the host or the checkout counter person. It was a little disconcerting, truthfully. And you brought it up a little bit earlier. I think a lot of that goes back to where we're getting our news from and which sources we're choosing to believe in. I think, if it was up to me, we would have a media literacy course taught in high schools that explain what a real journalist does and how they go about doing their work and the role of a real editor and how a real functioning news source works. Because a lot of the places that are calling themselves news sources now that are unfortunately incredibly popular are not going through the same rigorous fact-checking process that a legitimate organization is doing.
So pretty much then, the way that people are feeling, you think, is mainly driven by media, and I guess one can't help but the politics, right? I mean,
Yeah.
are we pretty much a games society? In other words, your side and my side, and then everything is discussed that way, or people just, once having chosen a side, you're never going to give up on that side, regardless of what info comes in? What do you think?
Right. I think that's certainly a problem. I mean, we're obviously growing more polarized, I think, all the time. And I certainly, discussing media is a tricky thing sometimes, because now I think when people say media, they're thinking of everything from the New York Times and NPR to Breitbart. And, I don't consider Breitbart or Fox News to be journalists or journalism. And so I get a little annoyed when people criticize the media for not covering this well or accurately, because I think a lot of times what you're saying is this non-news source is not covering the news correctly. And of course they're not, because none of them are journalists or trained editors or whatever. And so the fact that I think a lot of Americans aren't parsing out what is real news versus fake news, that kind of media illiteracy is really concerning to me, and I think really problematic for our democracy as a whole.
I like the idea of the education, media education. Do you think that's going to go over well? And how do we actually just get it going if that's going to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, those are the exact same questions I have for, our senators and Congress people right now. I mean, I would like to think that something like a media literacy course would be fairly well supported from both sides, though I don't think there's any real push to be making that happen right now, if I'm being totally honest with you. I mean, I haven't seen any bills crossing our state legislature in Nebraska or, nationally. So, yeah, I mean, I would love to be more optimistic about things like that, but I just don't see the signs right now that are telling me that it's getting better. And I think that's really, it's unfortunate, because I think people have this attitude now that the media is terrible and they're doing terrible jobs, but I think there's more and better journalists now than there ever have been. It's just that there's competition now from non-journalists posing as journalists. There's too much competing space in the media sphere right now that are giving what I consider real journalists a bad name.
Well, I see Jennifer's about to say something, so I shall butt up.
If you have a question, Fedora, I was just going to see what other questions we might have. So.
Okay, I was just going to say, is there really a need to depend upon our Congress people to initiate a program in school? I mean, it seems like can we not address concerns we find in our local communities locally? And then maybe it will go up, travel up the road. But if we keep waiting for them to initiate something, then it won't bode well, will it?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a really valid point. I think anything that can, sort of hatch organically probably has a better shot of lasting in general. I mean, it proves that the local support is there. And so, I mean, yeah, I would hope that we wouldn't have to rely on, some sort of top-down approach to this. I guess I only say that because this seems like a national problem. I mean, this problem with media literacy, I think, is happening everywhere right now. And so I'm talking nationally only because it would be nice to see a nation with a streamlined approach to teaching people how to parse fact from fiction.
What kind of things do you think should be included in such an endeavor?
A lot of times, well, I think we need to have more of a focus on, you know, probably the First Amendment in general and how it works and why we need it. But again, I think so many people, you know, I've had so many conversations with people who are so far removed from, I guess, media in general, not ingesting media, but how, you know, a journalist works. Like, I don't think a lot of people understand the work and the time and the patience like real reporting requires. You know, I mean, I don't think there would be so many people so quickly tweeting off little quips at journalists for how bad their story was if they knew the amount of time and effort that went into that kind of story. So I would love to just take a general audience and walk them through, you know, what David Quayman's last story in the New Yorker took to write and report, you know, how many scientists he had to talk to get that story about COVID, how many wildlife biologists he had to talk to get the real story of, you know, what role the pangolin is playing in the spread of COVID-19. I mean, those aren't fake scientists. That's not fake science. That's a journalist gathering so many opinions, pulling together, you know, one solid story. And then there's the whole fact checking team that goes over that. And then there's the process back and forth with his editor. And then it all goes back to him again to annotate his own story and give sources for every single one of those quotes, every single fact within that story. I mean, I think people would be blown away by just how much it takes to get a story like that through from start to finish in a way that is as objective as it possibly can be.
Well, I think you should do a Zoom, Carson.
I might need to, yeah.
I think you need to do that because right now, yeah. What you know, get in touch with me. I know a journalist that would be really good working with you.
Okay. I mean, and I say that too because, you know, I think people would very quickly see the difference in results and stories between, you know, a story like the one I was just talking about versus following whatever came out of Breitbart last week. And they would see that like, oh, one is something that required professionalism and drive and time and energy. And another one is based in nothing, you know?
Cool. Do that. Really, I'm serious now.
Okay.
I put a private thing in there, yeah.
Okay,
I'll do that again. Yeah. This is really cool. Nice.
So yeah, I think, you know, when you think about that media literacy, information literacy, whatever you want to call it, part of my background is in college teaching English and composition. And of course, there was always a little sliver of information literacy that we tried to do. Librarians, of course, were our best source on that, and they're one of the best sources for information literacy and media vetting and things like that. And I tried that. But what I often felt was, you know, if I'm dealing with college freshmen or college juniors and trying to talk about here's where you look on a website to find out who the creator is, what their credentials are, what kind of, you know, fact checking they might have, that sort of thing. You know, I just always felt like that's too late, you know, that it does need to start, you know, from an early age, like to be a part of all sorts of levels of the curriculum. You know, maybe it's not one class, but maybe you start with the elementary school kids to say, you know, you see something on TV, how do you know if it's true or false?
Right.
You go to that internet literacy kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think starting young is probably a great idea, though I will say, not to pick on the older generations, but I do find that more of that misinformation, at least online, is being spread by some of those generations that I think it's just now when you have, you know, Fox News right next to CNN, right next to whatever, and you're watching them on TV at home and nobody is there saying, this is entertainment, this is news. I think generations that didn't already grow up sort of media savvy and didn't know how to sort of wade through Twitter have maybe a harder time understanding that like there's misinformation floating out there everywhere all the time, every day, you know? And so I think though we should teach this probably in schools, I hope that someday there's a way to reach those that are beyond that age as well.
And remember, some of those that are beyond that age really don't want to change. You know, everybody has their little niche. You know, you said, I don't know if you, what you said, but I listened and went, okay, I don't remember what that is, because conservative,
Right.
left and liberal, right to the point, over here, ran out of gas. I don't know what all those are.
Right.
You know, I look at somebody and go, oh yeah, they're enthusiastic about this. And then somebody says, well, they're a such and such. I go, oh, no, it was just a young man. I don't know.
Yeah.
But people don't, a lot of times don't want to change because change requires work. And people sometimes just really don't want to work. And they know it's the truth. Now, I go on my thing with bullying. You know me, Jennifer. People remember how things were, and the lack of moving forward and making sure that other people don't move forward has become a thing.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's so cut and dry.
Oh no.
I think that you pretty much you go with what you're comfortable with or what you've learned, like Walter Cronkite and the news. So a lot of elderly people have grown up listening to Walter Cronkite and how that news was told, and the newer channels or whatever with misinformation have pretty much taken a marketing. You know, they're trying to duplicate that with misinformation. So if you have somebody standing up there, well, today, and then you are, well, he must have something very important to say. Well, he knows what's going on, and they just feel comfortable because it fits that mold that they have been used to.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of I hear this more and more, I think, all the time. People want, you know, there's this common thread that people always want more positive stories, right? They're so sick of how negative the news is. And I always think that's sort of a strange thing to say about the news, because the news isn't there to make you feel comfortable or to make you feel good. It's there to keep you informed on what's happening in our world and in our democracy and in our country and our towns. And, you know, it's doubly problematic that, especially in these rural areas, we're losing our only newspapers. So our only source of local news is gone. And guess what it's replaced by? Sean Hannity on the airwaves. Or, you know, it's just, we've devalued the news, both because our president seems to think that journalists are the enemies, and also just because we have apparently adopted this attitude, because it was free for so long online, that the news should always be free. And so then when we suddenly have to subscribe to it, we find that too much of a burden. So we drop our subscriptions, then we lose our local newspapers. And then it's this weird circular thing where there's no news anymore. And then they blame the journalists for not being, you know, not doing their job well. And it's just, you're not going to get good journalism if you don't value good journalism.
I like you.
I like you too.
I like you. Good. That is cool.
So we're a little past 11:30, so we're probably gonna need to wrap up shortly. But I'm wondering, are there any last questions about either Carson's book or just media and knowledge and facts in general?
No, because we're going to talk privately.
I just want to know how is it Dick? How is he doing?
That's a great question. It's been probably 6 months now, at least, since I last spoke to Dick. To be totally honest, I think it was a little bit of a rocky road for him when the book first came out. And I say rocky road only because I think, you know, Dick was a fairly private person to begin with. And so, as you can imagine, having a book that got, you know, national circulation was going to bring him some attention. He went offline intentionally to avoid a lot of that for a long time, and I sincerely hope that that helped him kind of get away from that. Last I heard, he was working on like his own, I think, sort of memoir or book, looking at all those events, which, you know, I would totally encourage. Obviously, you know, one thing that's really interesting about nonfiction that we talked about earlier is, you know, 60 different people in town, 60 different opinions on the zoo and what happened there. And so Dick, being the person that founded it and ran it for so long, he's certainly going to have his own angle on those events and those experiences. And so, you know, I'd be excited to read it. And I hope that, you know, I assume that if Dick was ready to write about it himself, that must mean that he's working through and processing some of that stuff himself. So last I heard, that's what he was working on. I assume he's still doing some of his local history stuff, but he's still in Royal and still working, I think.
That's terrific.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I do want to, first of all, thank Carson for spending this time with us this morning. I really appreciated your insights on the book and the media world and everything.
Thank you.
Else.
Thank you.
And I want to let everybody here know, too, that, of course, Carson is a presenter at the 2020 Festival of Books, which we just announced will be entirely virtual. It will start on October 1st and stretch through quite a bit of the month. So there will be other chances that we don't know quite yet when they are, as the schedule is still being formed. But yeah, there will be some wonderful panels that deal with some of these similar issues with you know, the importance of being an informed citizen. And I think it's just a really valuable thing right now. So you'll have other chances to hear from Carson. Take a look at sdbookfestival.com to find out more as we get that schedule together. And I appreciate all of you joining us this morning. Any last words that you want to leave us with, Carson?
Just thank you very much for having me this morning. It was really fun, and I appreciate all the questions.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks again to everybody for joining. We'll be here same time next week, and we'll hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon, Carson.
See ya.